Okay, so welcome to World War II class. We're going to just jump right in with this video lecture on the rise of fascism in Europe. We are going to start with the first true fascist that we see in Europe, Benito Mussolini, Il Duce. All right, well, let's just get right to it. So let's look at Italy. After World War One, there is some unrest because they did not feel they were treated fairly at Versailles. This would sting and again lead to some antipathy toward the rest of the West among Italians, Mussolini being one of them. Mussolini was also about stopping communism, which we'll see with Hitler as well. This is one of his driving forces. And so Mussolini wrote his doctrine of fascism. He also came up with the symbol of fascism, which was the fascis, which is a bundle of rods with an axe blade projecting. This was a symbol of fascist power, a symbol of Italian fascist power. And the bundle of rods, of course, meant the unity and everybody connecting in support of the power, which was the axe blade. Again, he promoted the fascists. This was in a lot of propaganda. Now, there is a fear of the red specter in Italy. As I mentioned, there is a fear of communism. There is a desire to stop communism from coming into Italy. Rightist elements in Italy had actually formed their own fighting squads to oppose the left. Mussolini was the leader of some of these squads. At a fascist party conference in October, Mussolini declared either the government will be given to us or we shall seize it by marching on Rome. Now, this is in October of 22, and this leads to the famous or infamous March on Rome. In that month, Mussolini hatched a plan to occupy public buildings in the major cities in north and central Italy, and after establishing power in these public buildings, he and his black shirts would march to Rome and demand resignation of and thus take over the Italian government. Now, what is the problem with this plan? The Italian army greatly outnumbered the fascists or any other military group it could organize, and technologically, the fascists were limited. They did not enjoy the weaponry that the Italian army did. They did not have the advanced weapons, as many of these inexperienced fighters simply brought farm tools from home to conduct their operation. So you've got farm tools versus guns. Yeah. Initially, the effort appeared to be working. Mussolini and his supporters occupied these buildings, but martial law was declared by the prime minister, Facta, and the Italian army was set up to crush the uprising. But wait, what could get in the way of this? King Victor Emmanuel III was not certain of his army's loyalty. Would it be to him? Would it be to the government in general? Would it side with the increasingly popular Mussolini and his fascists? Facta would end up resigning. The king feared conflict that the march might create and wanted to avoid a civil war. He also feared his cousin, the Duke of Acosta, might replace him if the king stood up to Mussolini and failed. The Duke of Acosta was a supporter of Mussolini and fascism. Mussolini would not march on Rome. Rather, he would arrive in the city by train, as would his black shirts, essentially welcomed by King Victor Emmanuel III. Upon arrival, he would be made prime minister by a weak and scared king. A ceremonial parade was held October 31st, 1922. One commentator stated, quote, "The Marx Brothers could not have bettered the whole affair," which again just kind of underscores the comical element. Much is made of this march on Rome, but it was literally not a march. So Mussolini takes power. What is fascism? If you've taken the 411 class, you've read about fascism, the doctrine that he wrote. You have Alfredo Rocco who wrote about it. Basically, fascism is about totalitarianism, the supremacy of an all-powerful state, the glorification of courage, the glorification of force, and the glorification of war. These are important themes. And it is about, again, one person being in charge. So Mussolini, once he comes into power, he would develop the Navy and the Air Force. Giulio Douhet, Douhet. I apologize for probably mispronouncing it. Air mastery emphasized the dominant Air Force, believed that this was influential. Italy had been limited because of economic backwardness in the past, but they believed that this was an essential tool for their military might. The goal was to rule the Mediterranean. France was currently in North Africa. Britain was in Africa as well, in East Africa. And basically, the point behind this was that Mussolini wanted to recreate the Roman Empire. He believed that with his leadership, he could bring back this history. And of course, what is the Roman Empire known for? It owned the Mediterranean, essentially. And so Mussolini believed, well, if I can get involved with this, I can kind of, push some people around, take some power in these areas, and we can reestablish the Roman Empire. Uh, it's also important to note that Mussolini's rise came prior to Hitler. Hitler actually was an admirer of Mussolini initially, particularly after the March on Rome. And we would see these two connect, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But and it's notable, too, that Mussolini would actually provide some financial support to the rising Nazi party in Germany. He allowed the SA and SS men to train with his own paramilitary brigade, the Black Shirts. And when Hitler rose to power, Mussolini praised this and hailed it as a victory for fascist ideology. Now, privately, though, he was scornful of Hitler. He called Mein Kampf boring, his theories coarse and simplistic. He considered Hitler's rise to power less glorious than his own. In a summit in Venice in June of 1934 called the Venice Summit, each of them thinking a little less of the other, as one can imagine two egos of that size clashing in one room. To be a fly on the wall. Mussolini, like Hitler, believed that white Europeans were the architects of civilization and culture, but he did not extend this to the rabid anti-Semitism that we see with Hitler. He emphasized nationalism as Hitler would too, but again, he emphasized history, and he goes back in ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, and its impact on civilization. So he connects these dots on his own. As mentioned, he emphasized nationalism, particularly the triumphs of ancient Rome, and while he did form this alliance with Germany, his main goals still revolved around Italy and its gains. Now, eventually, Mussolini would issue his Manifesto of Race in July of 1938, which stripped Italian Jews of citizenship and removed them from government occupations. This, of course, comes after his friendship with Hitler, really after the two have connected and decided to work together. And so Hitler's influence kind of reaches him here. Mussolini, not originally anti-Semitic, but of course, this Manifesto of Race will make a huge, huge difference. One of the first steps that he will take, of course, to reinitiate this Roman Empire would be his invasion of Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, as it was called at the time. This was the only African country not yet under European control. He invaded in an attempt to, again, rebuild the Italian Empire to replicate glories of ancient Rome with his focus on the Mediterranean, and of course that would mean Africa, specifically North and East Africa. No defense was put up to the invasion. The League of Nations had actually asked Italy, or had asked to restrict trade with Italy to try to punish them. This had no effect. The League of Nations, of course, was quite weak. And even though the League was critical of the move, they could really do nothing. Hitler, in response to that, would actually pull Germany out of the League in 1933, and he backed Mussolini in this way. And, of course, when the League marginalizes Mussolini with this directive, that will, again, lead him closer to Hitler. So the two kind of begin to form there. Now, so that's just a little bit about Mussolini's rise, a couple vague ideas, really, on fascism. And we're going to get to, of course, the big fascist everybody knows about would be Adolf Hitler. And what we see with Hitler and Germany after World War I, of course, much has been made of Versailles. Some point to that as leading the German people to supporting war. I think there's a lot more to that. There are plenty of scholars who argue that Versailles had nothing to do with the origins of World War II. There are some who argue that it had everything to do with the origins of World War II. And this is part of the beauty of the study of history, is a diversity of views, a diversity of ideas on motivation, on what led to change. Certainly, Versailles had an impact. Of course, the reparations, which I get to in a different video lecture, which were, of course, never really paid. The guilt clause at the Treaty of Versailles, which placed guilt on Germany, which embarrassed many of its citizens. But for Hitler, these economic problems, the depression that came after World War I, would, of course, lead many to search for answers, and he provided some. So we get to this. I mean, Hitler was rather pragmatic, um, certainly an ideologue, and of course, those two don't always match. But he recognized when he had an opportunity and he took it. One of the big factors that we see with Hitler as well is his hatred of communism. A lot of times you hear people say, "Oh, well, Hitler was a communist, the socialist. He had the socialist workers, whatever." Hitler hated communism. And one of the reasons, and when you watch the appeasement video, you'll see one of the reasons that the West appeased Hitler is because they hoped that he would stop the halt of communism from the Soviet Union. So now we get to Rise of Hitler, one of the most evil people, of course, one could argue, in the history of the world. Many evil people, but not all of them attain any power, of course. So why the rise of Hitler? He was able to garner how was he able to garner so much power? First part of it, of course, as I mentioned, timing. He's pragmatic. He recognizes what are the problems. There's a post-war depression that has affected all of Europe, not just the United States, and that will play a role, obviously, in how states interact and react to different issues. But the timing here, the depression, the post-war anger and disillusionment of people, of course, propaganda, his use of brutality and terror. He was a charismatic person. He gained a lot of attention that way, gained many followers that way. And some things that that we will discuss again further, his emphasis on nationalism, on anti-Semitism and anti-communism. Now, anti-Semitism, of course, there's a long history in Europe of blaming Jews for problems. And for Hitler, one of his main issues with Jews was he believed that Jewish people in Germany had gotten Germany out of World War I when Germany could have still won. So that is one of the main things, one of the main reasons he turns to this anti-Semitism. As mentioned, is anti-communism. There's an anti-communist element in Germany, and his desire to stop that spread will gain adherents. And the other one that I mentioned, nationalism, and this includes history. Very similar to Mussolini, he wants to create, of course, his Third Reich. He wants to bring the German Empire again to its proper place in the international world, in international politics, to make Germany a world power again. Now, the fall, we're going to go through quite a bit of history here, but just real quick. Well, we'll get to those 1930 elections. Sorry, I'm kind of all over the place here, but so we talk about the development of the party. Of course, by 32, the Nazi Party had won more than 1/3 of the seats in the Reichstag. It had become the largest single party within the representative body. But how did we get here? Let's first start talking about the National Socialist German Workers' Party, of course, National Socialist, Nazi. And this was about subjugation to the state and to the nation. This is where we come up, well, his term Gleichschaltung. Again, everything is for the sake of the state. Now, this is where you get that connection to socialism, right? I mean, socialism is about the power of the state in different ways. And for Hitler, his Gleichschaltung, this idea that everything is for the sake of the state. So you can kind of make that connection. But when we say socialist, there is no Marxism going on here. So again, subjugation, integration, total merger. Hitler believed the Judeo-Christian values of charity, meekness, and international brotherhood would weaken the German state, so he moved away from these. And again, he blamed World War I, the loss, on Jewish treachery at home, and then hostility at Versailles again helps to support his rise. So we get to a few of the different events that lead to Hitler's rise, because all of these taken together make a difference. His beer hall putsch in November of 1923, putsch meaning a coup or an attempt to overthrow the government. This was an attempt by Nazis to overthrow the German government, to create a unified a greater German Reich, where citizenship would be based upon race. Now, this is very much inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, which happened only the year previous, and this would be a march on Berlin. Hitler's goals here were to smash the opposition, to establish a dictatorial state with citizenship restricted to Nordic stock, to exclude Jews from political life, and pass emergency legislation that would allow, quote, the removal of all persons dangerous to security and useless eaters, to concentration camps where they could be productive via their labor. Now, the modern conception, I guess, of concentration camp, where we get to those that were part of the Holocaust. Those will come up later, and those will be developed later. But this is again an initial idea of his. And one of the terms here that's important to consider: useless eaters. Hitler was a eugenicist. He believed that those who did not contribute to productivity, to making the state better, should simply be eliminated. And so this is why he comes at this again, this idea of useless eaters, people who are eating but they're useless. Of course, one could look at disabled people. He foisted this upon homosexuals as well. Of course, we know about Jews, gypsies, etc. So these were groups that he considered were useless eaters. They should be either made productive laborers or they should simply be eliminated. The Nazi Party at this time was 50,000 members, many of whom wanted to take action against the Democratic Republic. Included in this group were Goering, Himmler, Rudolf Hess, and Wilhelm Frick. The radical and Volkisch nationalist coalition had united in formation of what was called the Kampfbund. I can never get this word right. Kampfbund, Kampfbund, or the Combat League. This included the Nazis. Meanwhile, members of the government itself also sought to end the Republican experiment. When they met to discuss overthrow, the meeting was crashed by Hitler and his league at the putsch. But mistakes are made. The conspirators failed to take over some offices, including police headquarters, which of course would have been key. Little control over the government leaders, and when they were left alone, they called on police forces and troops for assistance. So rather than try to take police headquarters and go from there, rather than either do that or take control of these leaders, keep them, kind of contained so that they cannot get help, they do not do this. It was flat out disorganized. Notably, after finding out about the betrayal of the three government leaders that he thought had supported him, Hitler stalled, which we're going to see during World War II as well, before leading his march to Berlin. This indecision gave time for Bavarian authorities to defend Munich, and the Nazis would be defeated. Now, one note here: for revolution to work, you need the police and the military on your side, and he was unable to do this. But again, I go back to this: his indecision gave time for Bavarian authorities to defend Munich, and of course, we know that during the war, all too often Hitler would, because of indecision, kind of became a deer in the headlights, froze, stalled, which led the Allies to be able to defend different areas. But we'll get to that down the road. So this failed ultimately, but it was good for propaganda reasons. This was an attempt to save the nation. Hitler learned he needed support of military and police, but more importantly, recognized that he would need to take advantage of the democracy to subvert the state from within. Keep that in mind. The party was banned, but the ban was lifted in 1925 when Hitler would restructure the party. After the Nazis came to power later, he established November 9th as a Reich Day of mourning because of the failed putsch. And at trial, of course, what did Hitler claim? That the federal government had betrayed Germany by signing Versailles, and claimed there was an imminent threat of communism to Germany. And he was going to stop that. Good old Hitler. 1932 would be an important year for the Nazis. The German presidential election would be held, the third under the Weimar Constitution. This was held in March and then in April. Paul von Hindenburg was the incumbent. He would go against Hitler and Ernst Thälmann, who was a communist. Hindenburg wanted to end his presidency after his second term, which began in 1925, but he kept his name on the ballot to prevent Hitler from winning. In April, the Nazis would increase their representation in the Prussian Landtag from 9 to 162 seats, making them the largest party in the body. And Prussia represented nearly 62% of the land area of Weimar Germany. So this was significant. Now, Prussia, of course, you may go back a couple hundred years. Oh, Prussia, yeah. Well, Prussia, of course, is one of the key parts that leads to the unification of Germany in the 19th century. And it remains, again, a large part, both population and physical size, of Germany. So when the Nazis take over, or when they increase their representation and they become dominant in this area, it is a rather significant event. In July later that year, the German Reichstag election, after von Papen had been appointed chancellor and the Reichstag dissolved in June, the Nazis would win 230 seats, 37% of the total, which was the largest in the Reichstag. The communists had 100 seats at this time. Von Papen thought Hitler would side with him, But with this strength, he declared he would not join a coalition government. He's got 37%. He's thinking, hey, maybe we can increase this. In September, there would be a no confidence vote in von Papen, in the von Papen government, and Hindenburg would dissolve the newly seated Reichstag one more time. In the crucial election of November of 1932, the 84-year-old Hindenburg inadvertently helped Hitler to the position of chancellor. Franz von Papen, who was one of Hindenburg's most trusted underlings, convinced him that a multi-party cabinet with the Nazis as a distinct minority, he could control Hitler if he was chancellor. So, von Hindenburg thinks, okay, well, again, if we can kind of have this coalition government and we can keep the Nazis as a minority, even if Hitler is chancellor, we can control him. January 30th, 1933, Hitler is appointed as chancellor. Hitler, though, would outflank the opposition in the cabinet. He succeeded in having Hindenburg approve a series of Article 48 measures, which essentially ended civil liberty in Germany. The Nazis won 32% of the seats in this election. So this adds, they were at 37, but they won 32% of those that were available in this election. Hitler's cabinet issued a decree for the protection of the German people on February 4th, 1933. What did this mean? There were constraints placed on the press. This also authorized the police to ban political meetings and marches. A little while later, February 27, 1933, the German parliament, or Reichstag, was burned to the ground due to arson. The government would claim it was done by communists in an effort to overthrow the state. Hitler, again, being pragmatic in some ways, took this opportunity to permanently suspend civil rights and render the protection of the German people decree, once temporary, as a now permanent act. Convinced that this was started by communists, Hindenburg approved of the decree for the protection of the people and the state as well. This would also be known as the Reichstag Fire Decree. This was declared on the final day of February of 1933. Ultimately, again, what this does is it permanently suspends the right to assembly, free speech, or free press. The regime was allowed to arrest and incarcerate political opponents without charge. It dissolved political organizations, suppressed publications, gave the central government the authority to overrule the state and local laws and overthrow state and local governments. It suspended all restraints on police investigations as well. The press described Hitler's action as saving the nation from Bolshevism, and his popularity grows. March 23, 1933, Hindenburg signed the Enabling Bill, which gave Hitler dictatorial power, quote, for protection of people and state. Hitler could make laws without even consulting the Reichstag now. Moderates preferred radical extremism of the Nazis to the revolutionary extremism of the communists. Trade unions would be destroyed, civil service and bar were purged of Jews, and in July, political parties would be banned. President Hindenburg would eventually die in August 34. The offices of Chancellor and President would be merged under Hitler's leadership. August 19th of 1934, Hitler would declare himself Führer, or leader of the German Reich. Now, the communists, again, are blamed for burning down the Reichstag. But let's get to more of the events that lead to Hitler's. We've already seen his rise. How is he going to maintain and control this? Then we'll get to some of his key ideas. The Night of Long Knives, or Operation Hummingbird, the Rome Putsch, which occurred June 29th through July 2nd of 1934. Why the violence here? Rome was, ROHM, was in charge of the SA and the stormtroopers. A substantial army of 2 million men that were used as the enforcer of the party's dictates. Now, he was a loyal Nazi. He had been loyal to Hitler since his rise, and his growing popularity rendered others jealous. For example, Himmler and Goering were jealous of him, and those are two guys, of course, you don't want to have a problem with you. Those two would convince Hitler that Rome was planning to try and overthrow Hitler. He, in turn, of course, wanted to get rid of potential rivals and knew he needed the support of the army leadership, who he felt already looked down on him because he had merely been a corporal in the military. The army also viewed the SA as a threat to their authority, though, as they were outnumbered by the SA by 1934, and Rome had hinted that the SA would simply absorb the army into its ranks. So you've got a lot of antipathy here towards Rome, some of it legit, some of it absolutely not legit. Hitler made a pact. If Rome and the other SA leaders were removed, the rank and file SA men would come under the control of the army as long as the army swore an oath of loyalty to Hitler. The army agreed. The evening of June 29th and 30th, the evenings of June 29th and 30th, SS units arrested leaders of the SA and other political opponents and carried this out the next 2 nights. 77 men would be executed on charges of treason. The number is likely higher. It's probably considerably higher, but we don't have those exact numbers. But at least 77 men were executed for treason. Rome was shot. Others were simply bludgeoned to death. The SA was placed under the command of the army. Hitler received his oath of allegiance from the army. Significantly, this represents when Hitler declared he no longer needed the courts, that he was the supreme judge. And we know this mindset would dominate Germany throughout the remainder of his rule. The SS became the most feared force in Germany and only strengthened the power of Himmler. The SS would assume control of the centralized police force and a centralized concentration camp system by 1937. All police forces under the direction of Himmler and his SS. The SS then becomes independent of the SA, and the SA becomes less important over time, essentially not disappearing, but becoming quite minimal. Now, I mentioned earlier that it's important to have the police and the military on your side. It's also good to have the press on your side, right? We know this in America. Anyway, the Daily Mail, July 2nd, 1934, announced this, quote, Adolf Hitler, the German chancellor, has saved his country. Swiftly and with inexorable severity, he has delivered Germany from men who had become a danger to the unity of the German people and to the order of the state. With lightning rapidity, he has caused them to be removed from high office, to be arrested, and put to death. The names of the men who have been shot by his orders are already known. Hitler's love of Germany has triumphed over private friendships and fidelity to comrades who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the fight for Germany's future. Now, as I mentioned, there's no freedom of the press here. It's not like Hitler wrote this, though, right? I mean, he could have, but this just shows, again, the press is on board with Hitler. And when you think of the things that they are supporting here, it's quite disturbing. But again, this shows everything's coming together for Hitler. He has this control. He knows that these people are not going to deviate from his decisions. So, with the press jumping on board, again, people who may not be in the know read that and they believe it, right? So, if you believe everything the press tells you, then it's a pretty slippery slope. And so this, again, underscores how we get so many Germans who support Hitler, strangely enough. And from 1933 to 36, what occurs? There's actually economic prosperity. Part of this, of course, is due to arms buildup. When you watch the appeasement video, you will see the different ways in which Hitler was able to rebuild the military. And of course, this provides jobs, this provides productivity, prosperity, etc. And again, part of this was he expanded the military. The economic policy of deficit budgeting, putting money in public works and the industry. So again, you have Hitler finding these different ways to garner support because, hey, if you've got a job and you can make a living, you're probably going to be okay, right? You're not going to call for revolution. So that's 33 to 36 in general. One thing that we see in 35, of course, in September, the Nuremberg laws. Now, these go a long way, again, toward not only, the Holocaust has essentially already been initiated in idea, but this goes to perpetuate and render this permanent. Hitler claims, quote, legal regulation of the problem of Jews in Germany was the only way to stop the, quote, defensive actions of the enraged population. Again, note the term defensive. He defines what a Jew is. 3 or more grandparents who were Jewish. If there were only 2, then half Jew. If married to one or part of a community, treated as a full Jew. If baptized Christian, you were able to keep that citizenship initially. Now, what did the Nuremberg laws do? Number 1, they took away German citizenship from all full Jews and half Jews. Number 2, it prohibited Jews from flying the German flag. Eventually, Germans married to Jews were also prohibited from doing this. It prohibited sexual relations between Aryans and Jews. It prohibited marriage between Aryans and Jews. Which gets, of course, to his final solution, which we'll talk about that here in a minute. But this, again, is supported by the anti-Jewish propaganda of the state led by Goebbels. This would include leaflets, posters, newspaper articles, newsreels, speeches, records, more later when we get to 1941, but these are all part of this effort to paint the Jews as the problem in Germany. And so those who already believe this, hey, great, somebody's finally taking action, right? For those who maybe did not believe this, and he comes out, he says, oh, look at what this population's done, blah, blah, blah. It, again, leads to some support in this area. But this is part of his overall goal, is to exterminate the Jews. And we're going to get to this later on when his final solution is truly developed. Okay. Couple more things. I want to get to the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, and then we'll get to Hitler's core ideas. November 9th through the 10th, 1938. This is when we have the Night of Broken Glass. A couple days previous, November 7th, German junior diplomat Ernest von Rath was killed by 17-year-old Polish Jewish refugee whose parents had been deported from Germany to Poland. This sets off what was called the Night of Broken Glass, which was a coordinated terror through Germany and throughout Germany and Austria. Synagogues were burned, Jewish homes were destroyed, Jewish shops were ransacked, hundreds of Jews were killed, tens of thousands were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The rest of the world is repulsed by these actions. Neville Chamberlain, with his umbrella in tow, still felt he could secure peace. He didn't understand the widespread criticism. The stage is now set. The world knows what is in store with Hitler, and World War II would begin shortly thereafter. Again, I mentioned Chamberlain here. You'll hear more about him in the appeasement video. So let's get to Hitler's core ideas and what these mean for the next few years. The quintessence of his idea, of course, of his ideas was racism. Borrowed from Friedrich Nietzsche and Houston S. Chamberlain, the Nordic Germanic race was at the top of the racial hierarchy because it had always created the highest socio-political and cultural values. Other races opposed this. They tried to pervert these, but the Nordic race, the Nordic Germanic race, Northern Europe, created and sustained these institutions that truly bred civilization, according to Hitler. As I mentioned earlier, Christian values paralyzed the natural Teutonic virility and aggressiveness. These made German men weak. The driving force of history was the struggle of races. Think about Marx. What drove history? The struggle of the class struggle. For Hitler, it is racial struggle. Race first, state second. The citizens' highest privilege was to live and work for the nation. Again, Gleichschaltung, everything for the nation. One folk, one state, one leader. His goal was to unify all German-speaking people with this phrase. Of course, this is used in many efforts with propaganda. It basically boils everything down. One folk, one state, one leader. I mentioned his racial purity was enhanced by his support of the idea of eugenics, which we have a history of in the United States as well. Some prominent Americans who supported that. But we'll move on to World War II. The state for Hitler was a means to an end, to preserve racial purity and territorial expansion, Lebensraum. He believed the British, who were Anglo-Saxon, were thus blood brothers. The French were mongrels and thus inferior. Thus, his main enemy was the French. And he would build fronts to battle the French, of course. And where does he go into essentially first? He goes into France. His objective was not to exact revenge, but to acquire living space. Again, Lebensraum. The German people needed living space. Two main assumptions that Hitler made. One, that Britain and the United States would clash, thus preventing their collusion against the Germans. Number two, that the Soviet Union was weak. It was ruled by incompetent, quote, Jewish Bolsheviks and Slavs. So Hitler very much takes the Soviets, takes the Russian people for granted. And, you know, when you look at the early Soviet efforts in the war, one can kind of see this, but he believed, and when you watch the Barbarossa video lectures, you'll see and hear some of his claims about the Soviet Union. Just kick in the door and the whole rotting structure will come down. So he takes that for granted. As far as Britain and the U.S., again, he believes that Britain will eventually come to their senses and side with Hitler and the German people. The United States won't do this, and so once the British come and support Germany, they will fight, and the British can take out the Americans. His belief about the British people helps to explain a few things in his actions, some of his delays against the British people, for example, because he felt this kinship with them. Uh, Strange, and again, knowing his methods and knowing how democracy in the West works, it's kind of interesting that he would think Britain would come around, but spoiler alert, they do not. So that is the rise of fascism. Um, there is also a video lecture on the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which focuses on Japan's development. Very important to watch.